What's up? This is David Lee Kim, co-founder of Omniscient Digital, and you're listening to The Long Game. In this episode, we chat with Sam Richard, head of growth at ngrok. ngrok is the programmable network edge that adds connectivity, security, and observability to your apps with no code changes. Previously, Sam was VP of growth at OpenView, where she worked closely with portfolio leadership teams to discover and implement the most impactful strategies for growth. This included onboarding, retention optimization, expansion strategy, funnel optimization, and partner strategy. In this conversation, we start by learning about Sam's career trajectory from an operator to venture capital. Then we jump into product-led growth, what companies are doing it well, and how you can benchmark yourself against those companies. We get deep into user acquisition tactics and activation metrics, so get ready. This was a really insightful conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Sam Richard. All right. Hey, Sam, how are you doing? Happy Friday. Welcome to The Long Game. Thanks for making time.
Thank you. Happy Friday, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I've been paying attention to some of your work and OpenView over the last couple of years when you first started coining product-led growth, which we'll get into. And we'll just jump into the conversation here. And I think a good place to start is you were an operator before you were in VC. Tell us about that career arc. What was it like being an operator? How'd you end up in VC?
Well, I always like to caveat all of my conversations with, I'm not really a VC. But I could go into that a little bit more as I talk about the arc. I sort of found myself in VC. I never really meant to go into it. I started my career working in governmental consulting. I actually majored in political science and was really excited about solving large problems for the world. But I graduated at a time in which all of the large governmental agencies were not hiring anyone. So I quickly found myself bored in government work. It tends to be a little bit slower paced. And I tend to be like a bull in a china shop in places like that. So bureaucracy and I are not friends. I started working at a marketing agency and found a lot better fit. These were sort of the early days of digital marketing and attribution. So I was sort of like the back of shop person who was doing a lot of spreadsheet action and, working with clients to make sure that we were optimizing for them. And then I moved in-house to a startup called Hourly Nerd here in Boston, which is now known as Catalant. They were very early days. I think I was the 11th hire. And I was running sort of all marketing operations, sales operations, and paid acquisition. So again, big spreadsheet girl, big into operations and optimization. But I got to work with Dan Slagan, who's the CMO at the time, who's really wonderful and was a HubSpot alum. And I learned a lot about brand and how to run B2B marketing. From there, I moved on to a company called Dispatch, where I was brought on as the head of marketing. But then realized very quickly that I didn't necessarily need to be a marketer in the formal sense because we only had a few potential customers that we could have. But in order to be really successful with their customers, we had to figure out how to onboard hundreds of thousands of service providers. So plumbers, electricians, et cetera, who didn't necessarily love technology. So I spent a lot of time on planes teaching plumbers, et cetera, how to use their mobile phones and mobile apps. And through that time, I had a lot of really interesting sort of lightning thoughts around, how we could build the product to make my job easier and how we could build our messaging to make my job easier and how we could build all of these things so that I wouldn't necessarily need to be on a plane all of the time. So at the time, I didn't really realize it. I called myself the head of growth and I was just pulling as many levers as possible to avoid these one-to-one discussions I was having with folks. And I didn't necessarily realize what I was doing at the time was product-led growth. But in speaking with the team at OpenView, once I sort of was looking around at my next move after we had sold Dispatch to Vista Equity Partners, I very clearly realized what I was doing was on that verge. And I had learned a lot by doing, and I had already made a lot of connections in that space that I was really trying to learn from. So the transition over to VC felt very natural to me because I was going to be doing product-led growth and implementing product-led growth at a lot of OpenView's portfolio companies at the time. And I've been here ever since.
That is so fascinating. I just had another conversation with Thomas Schiavone, He's a
Okay.
co-founder of Calixa. He was
Oh
like
yeah.
first
Yeah, I
PM
know
at
Thomas.
Twilio.
Yep.
Yeah, first PM
He's
at
brilliant.
Twilio. And he was like, yeah, we
Yeah.
were doing product-led sales before it was a thing. And
Yeah.
I asked him this question, so I'm curious how you thought about it. But when you're trying to build kind of those new motions into your product and that customer journey, how are you even thinking about that? If there's other people, you didn't really have people who already done it that
Yeah.
much. So how do you model yourself? What do you model yourself after? How do you figure out those new user experiences?
Yeah. I mean, I've always looked to B2C. I was a huge fan of Joanna Lord, who worked really closely in B2C. I look a lot at online dating applications because they are
Mm,
subscription based and they are just optimizing really hard to move you into something. And I also look at social media because ultimately, these guys are like the masters of psychology. They have millions and millions of users. They know what people want and they know how to move people in that direction by hook or by crook. And, I find so much inspiration in those types of products. And I feel like the B2B world should do that more frequently. And what I think is most interesting, especially when you think about hiring, is people always want the Thomases in the world who've worked at Twilio and been there. But I think that there's a lot to be said for folks who've come from this high velocity testing background, like someone from Kayak
mhm.
or someone from Hinge or something like that too. So I'd like to see more mixing in the space.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, there was this phrase of like the consumerization of B2B. And
Hmm.
I feel like that phrase has faded away a little bit, but I know recently you've been talking about how, it's B2B, but you're still selling to humans.
Yeah,
So why aren't we seeing more of these user experiences reflected in these business products? And
yeah,
it sounds like that's something you look for a lot in your portfolio companies. And maybe we can kind of go into that. You mentioned you're in VC, but you're not a VC.
yeah.
What does a VP of growth at a VC firm do?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. OpenView is pretty unique in that we have actually a larger quote unquote platform team than we do an investment team. So our platform is made up of
Hmm.
ecosystem, talent, growth, and capital markets. Capital markets is a lot of former bankers. We help our companies exit the way that they want to in a way that makes sense for the fund. Talent is easy to comprehend, at least, not necessarily easy to execute on. We have a wonderful team that helps our portfolio companies and potential investments hire some of the best talent in the market, not just at an executive level, but also at an IC level. And then we have our ecosystem team, which makes really important introductions, not only as customers, but also as mentors and potential board members.
Hmm.
And then finally, the growth team, which is made up of myself, Kyle Poyer, and Kurt Townshend. We work really closely with our portfolio and potential prospects on ways that they can improve their go to market. So things like pricing and packaging, things like strategy in terms of acquisitions, things like implementing best practices from product led growth, things like optimizing their onboarding. We help potential prospects as well as portfolio companies make those changes, almost like an in house consulting firm.
Yeah, it really sounds like an agency of sorts,
Yeah.
whereas
Yeah.
but your clients are all the portfolio companies and I imagine you have a stake in helping them succeed too. So there's
I
actually skin
certainly
in the
do.
game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of skin in the game. And it's just nice to have like the long-term relationship where, I've worked with someone's data for 2 years at this point. I know where the skeletons are buried, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I know why certain changes won't necessarily make sense. So it's a lot more of a relationship based. Um, and they always have me to turn to in case they need sort of like an interim head of growth or they want someone to talk to about something that's completely innovative and they may not have the talent in house for it.
Yeah. That's a great model. I've gotten
Yeah.
on some calls with founders and they're like, how should I solve this problem? Like, give me access to your data. Let's talk about what else is going. We're not going to solve this in a 30-minute call. Let's have a
Yeah.
couple calls and work through it. But
Yeah.
it seems like a great way to actually get familiar with the business. And you're not just signing a check and then like, good luck or anything like that. See them once a quarter.
Well, and what I've found is some of the greatest growth minds in the industry today are really looking to go out on their own and really sort of be consultants. So what I like to
Mhm.
think of a lot of my role is I build a roadmap for an IC to come in and execute. I hear from founders quite a bit that they need someone who's strategic say or to like make a plan to do certain things. And then they need the team to execute on it. So I think it helps fill that gap too, because a lot of these companies are unable to hire some of the top talent as heads of growth because very fairly, they don't necessarily want to have a 9 to 5 anymore.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about product-led growth, PLG. I know it's been a few years now since this has become a more mainstream concept. I don't know if you can call it actually mainstream yet, but if you could define that for the listeners, because some people will call it bottoms up, some people call it freemium, some people call it self-service. How do you define product-led growth?
Yeah. Well, so I subscribe to the Blake Bartlett School of Product-Led Growth. He's a partner at OpenView, or he was the original investor in Calendly. He's wonderful, and he actually coined the term in 2016. But the definition that I like to use is where the product itself is the engine of acquisition, monetization, and retention. If you think about the product doing a lot of the heavy lifting, it changes a lot of your go-to-market. So when you see a product doing those things for the bulk of the users, that's when I would say that becomes product-led. So a lot of people will say that's freemium, or they'll say that's free trial. I don't necessarily always agree. I think there's definitely a spectrum. But I think that's like a really good example of a way that you can look at a product to decide whether or not it's product-led.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of ground the rest of the conversation. And right before this, so you had mentioned that one of the challenges you're seeing founders run into is around more the acquisition piece.
Yes.
Why is that? What do you see founders running into nowadays?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is we all have goldfish brains, right? We're all on TikTok. We're all not really willing to pay attention to a lot of things. But I also think when you design something and you really fall in love with it, it's hard to take a step back and say, what is the main value proposition of this product to someone who has no idea what it is? So, in going back into product-led sales, I think that the companies that are in the product-led sales realm have done a really good job of making their products problem first. Where the problem is like, I have all this data on what my users are doing, but I have no idea how to tie it back to sales. But there are other spaces in which that doesn't happen at all. So one of the reasons why Expensify was so successful over sort of like other products who are behemoths who are in the same space, the expense reporting space, was because they went after that consumer and they said, expense reports suck. That was their entire value proposition. They went after that user pain and like what they were solving for, rather than, hey, we're going to make your expense reporting so much faster. And they went after that finance persona. I think it's really solving for that end user pain and making sure that message comes through in every single thing that you do and how you speak to the world.
Yeah, Expensify is great. I remember the days of using Concur. I don't know if you ever used that.
Yes.
I used to have to block out like 2 hours. Oh, I'm good. I mean, that's fortunate for you.
Yeah.
It was not fun, especially once those expenses started adding up. But I think this is all interesting to me because I was at HubSpot for 5 years. They were one of the B2B SaaS companies that was an existing business that implemented product-led growth after the fact, which I was fortunate to get front row seats and be a part of that whole thing. What B2B SaaS companies are doing product-led growth well that stand out to you?
Oh, I mean, there's I don't know. For example, HubSpot has done it well, and I think that they've navigated the transition really well, because they were very much inbound marketing. They were very sales led. I mean, they wouldn't build product until they were selling it. If you think that Dan Lyons is accurate in his writing, which I was just like, HubSpot's a great company after I read that book.
I actually have not read that book, but I have an idea.
I just it was hard for me to see eye to eye with him because I was like, they're doing all the best things. But so I think that they've done a really good job sort of showing the world that you can transition from a sales-led model on a very heavy product. I mean, to get a ton of value out of HubSpot, you had to be really committed. But they've figured out different ways and paths to get there, and it's taken them years. But other companies that are, fully what I say, like PLG native, Notion's obviously done a really wonderful job of building for their most passionate users and then expanding beyond that. I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Calendly, who's one of the best product-led companies in the world. And then I think that there's an opportunity for a lot of companies who weren't necessarily product-led or weren't necessarily selling into a product-led market specifically in the security space to really emerge. I'm a huge fan of gray noise. I'm also, Okta has also started to make that transition to becoming more product led with a trial. And then Jump Cloud is also in the OpenView portfolio. They've done a really great job of sort of building on sort of this core and then making it more product led over time too.
So when you think about other B2B SaaS companies, and maybe this is where we can start talking about the benchmark report a little bit, but what are sort of the high level recommendations that these software companies who are trying to make that transition, how should they be thinking about that?
I think they should always lean into their strengths. Every company has something that's really unique about it, or else they wouldn't probably be very successful as is. And it's, sometimes it's hard to take a step back and say, what are our strengths as an organization? But there's always some strength that they can have. And I think to put HubSpot up as an example, they've always spoken really well to marketers. They've always known their personas. They've always known what marketers want and what drives them. So they leaned into those strengths by developing first sidecar products to attract marketers, like the website creator, and then Sidekick, which is one of my favorite products, that actually attracted BDRs, which are managed typically by marketers. And then they started thinking about other ways that they could attract marketers through organic traffic. So what are the things that like a young marketer would Google? Well, how much do marketers get paid? How to set up an SEO report, those types of things. HubSpot owns that world. And that's because they live and breathe marketers and they know what marketers want. So, that's one example of a company really finding their strength and knowing who their personas are. I think another really great example is Sneak. They realize that, developers do not want to talk to them. So they build SEO for developers who have a lot of questions. They have this entire library of open source tools. And they answer the question of, is this safe? Can I implement this at work? And then finally, they have this entire self-service motion where you can get up and running on Sneak and pay thousands of dollars a month just with a swipe of a credit card, and you never have to talk to a person. And they really built for that particular strength that they have of not requiring that DevOps person to actually speak to a human being, which I think is great too.
Yeah, the developer marketing and SEO space is fascinating because I think a lot of folks try to copy HubSpot playbook of the 101 keywords and doing more tutorials and how-tos. But when you go into different audiences like developers, the content should be about the product and the APIs and documentation and how to get set up. And it's fascinating because I've run into a lot of situations where companies will try to create kind of 101 type content for developers. And they sniff out the BS immediately. They're like, this is written by a marketer. It makes no sense. And so I think after being in that space for a little bit with DBT, I realized, that's a very different audience. Let's figure out a playbook for them.
Yeah. Well, I almost feel like marketers should be informed or consultative on any sort of developer facing content. Like they should get the final sign off, but they should not be the creator. I always think that docs themselves are a really great opportunity to inform the reader of like what's paid, what's not, like what's so great about this product, what's not. But it needs to be like lightly sprinkled into the docs. It should not be the point of the docs. But most docs are just technical and they have they don't even have pricing. They don't have tiers. They have nothing based on them either. So there's a level of optimization that could be done there too. Yeah.
So I've asked you a little bit about, hey, what companies are doing PLG well? What can other people be learning from these companies? And maybe this is a point, like, tell us about the product benchmarks report, because so far it seems like the only resource where you can get some sort of idea of how well companies are doing and at least have something to show yourself like, oh, how well am I doing?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the problems that founders typically have most frequently is they don't know where to be spending their time, and their time is very limited. The most important aspect of having a startup is staying incredibly focused. And my favorite part of the product benchmarks report, which is not getting enough attention, and I think I laid out the page wrong, which is my bad, is there's actually a product benchmarks calculator where you can compare yourself to your peers that has interactive filters. You can figure out if it's by single player products versus multiplayer products, by different types of software, horizontal or vertical, by companies with different growth rates. And to me, these are sort of like the guardrails, the speed limits on the highway that you should be following. So if you're not falling
Mm.
into the median or top quartile here for this specific metric, you as a founder or you as a team should be working on those metrics to figure out how can we get them back into place. And to me, that's like the starting point of where I want everyone to sort of like think about the product benchmarks once they understand the metrics and what they mean.
Yeah, I personally have a little gripe with benchmarks because my
Okay.
response is always, well, good for us means doing better than our baseline. But
Yeah.
like if our baseline's 2% and a company has a 15% conversion rate, it's a very different business model.
Yeah.
So it's put me in some situations where I had to explain a lot of that, but also I think on the flip side, it sets a bar, right? Like we shouldn't be happy with just 2% because that's our baseline. We should aim for something higher. So it's been a really valuable tool for me to at least speak to execs of like, hey, here's what we can expect or at least aim for.
Yeah. And this year I added that calculator because I wanted to push back on those execs who are trying to hold you to that number. Because then you can say, well, that's someone that has a free trial. We're freemium. So our conversion rates are inherently lower. Or like, look, these numbers actually get lower as you become a standout PLG business. Like the conversion rates for
That was
standout PLG
interesting.
businesses are incredibly low. And then finally, once you actually download the report, I hate to send people home with just a number and not homework. So it comes along with case studies on how you can improve those metrics as well.
Yeah. And you've been running that report for, I believe, 3 years now, right?
Correct. Yeah.
What have been some surprising or unexpected findings or trends over the last 3 years?
So this year I made a concerted effort to get more large companies to fill out the report. I actually sent them like directly to heads of product and growth that owed me favors at like
Yeah.
large like Cloud 100 companies. I can't use their names, but I appreciate them filling it out. And it's always surprised me how low these numbers are trending. Like conversion rates around 5%, 4% are the norm now. And if I sit myself back in that operator chair, I always felt like a failure to have rates that low. And I had wished that I had had this report to say, hey, look, you have an enormous top of funnel. Like, here's what this looks like. And you're actually not a failure. You're just comparing yourself to sales-led models.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember I was building out some growth models and they're asking, oh, why is the sign-up conversion rate so low? And I'm like, what makes you believe it's going to be a 20% conversion rate?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So,
We've been in Salesforce.
the work you're doing for this report is very helpful for folks who are pushing back against sometimes ambitious and sometimes unrealistic expectations as someone that's been an operator myself.
Yeah. Well, I think another thing that's really surprising, and I think it speaks to the ivory tower that I live in on LinkedIn, which is a weird place. Don't go there. It's really more about how companies are interpreting the sort of things that I'm putting out there. So for example, this was the first year I've always asked the question of what is your activation metric and what percentage are you hitting with your activation? But I've never felt confident enough publishing it because many people, their activation metric is literally just someone coming back to the app. So like the teachings are not necessarily there, like the definitions are not there and the awareness is not yet there. And you said it spot on earlier in the podcast. You said like, you know, PLG is not there yet. It's just still an emerging trend. And if you're me working at OpenView, the company that, you know, coined the term PLG, you're surrounded by it, you live and breathe it. But it's a really helpful reminder that this is really new for folks. And I'm lucky enough to get to speak to very large corporations about product-led growth and how they can implement it in their business as well. So it's really interesting, and it's interesting to see how many people are sitting up and listening.
Yeah. The activation metric one I feel like is one of the most controversial metrics. One, because it's different for every company. But for me, what was interesting is you define it differently as well. So maybe you can share that definition, and like I'd love to have like a dialogue about that because I define it quite differently from you. So it's interesting to hear how others do it.
Yeah. I mean, I define it as the aha moment in which someone discovers value in your product. It can only happen once and it needs to happen relatively quickly, depending on your product's, you know, difficulty in use. And for a very advanced organization, I always recommend also defining that that aha moment differently by persona as well. So how do you define it?
The first part I define as saying like that aha moment. I think,
of course.
I think that the part in the report you define it as like 50% or more people have to do it,
Yeah.
which I think is relevant. The angle I took, and let me know what you think about this. I could be completely wrong.
Uh-huh.
Angle I took was, what are the actions that are leading indicators for higher retention?
Got it.
So sure, everyone's taking a bunch of these actions that mean they're using a product, but what's that one set of actions or one action that if they take it, they see more value and their retention of that cohort like doubles, or like you see
Yeah.
a meaningful improvement. So that's how I thought of it, which
Uh-huh.
feels a bit more narrow compared to yours. And maybe I'd set myself up for a difficult situation.
Well, and one of the things that I do with opening new portfolio companies when they first come on board is actually do a deep dive into their data to find their activation
Mm,
indicator. And most of the time, it is more intense than it necessarily needs to be. And I try and cast a wide net by saying it is easily achieved by the average user. But most of the time,
mm,
people will use sort of like an integration or something like that. I imagine you had something similar at HubSpot. And that's great. And it's usually like directionality correct, but it can be difficult because it's not happening as quickly. And if I'm running marketing campaigns, and ultimately the goal of that marketing campaign is to get someone activated because I know it correlates highly to them converting, then, 3 or 4 days makes a difference in my budget dramatically. So I always try and want to like move that activation metric up to like a 5 to 7 day window. So I'll look
mm.
for something that's there and has the same sort of correlation to success for that user.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We, I think we're pretty much thinking about it the same way. I remember one
Yeah.
mistake I made. Once the activation metric was defined, all the efforts for optimizing for the activation metric. So I'm guilty of this earlier on, where it's like, oh, we want them to take this action. Let's have a checklist where that's one of the actions for them to do. But that it kind of skewed the data. Like all of a sudden, activation just skyrocketed, and we were like, this is not accurate. They're not actually seeing value. They're just doing what we told them to do.
Yeah, I've seen it too where people will have like a false piece of data. Like for example, like Calendly had like an automatic meeting created that just raised the bar for activation. Because
Yeah.
ultimately when you create a meeting in Calendly, you're activated. But if they already have one, then it becomes that you need to create 2 meetings in Calendly and it does
Yeah.
skew the data. And it's very difficult to follow.
Yeah, these are sort of things where I think
Yeah.
earlier on you kind of learn the hard way, like, wait, we're lying to ourselves here.
Well, and I feel like there's this lore around growth, around like I always roll my eyes when I hear growth hacking, because the growth
Mhm.
hackers are the ones who think of that really creative thing and it really blows people away. But if you give it a year or you give it 2 years, you tend to see it backfire. And I think one really great example of a company who's been around for a long time and is like sort of seen these things play out is Dropbox, who is a B2B
Mhm.
product, but they're also very B2C. So they have a lot of folks coming through. And they've made a lot of changes to the product in the last few years because I feel like they were optimizing for the wrong things and they finally realized it.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that could be a whole. I was gonna bring up maybe Dropbox and even Slack as an example of maybe PLG companies that hit a ceiling a little bit on their
Uh-huh.
go-to-market, and they had to implement a sales team eventually and build that out. And we see how both have played out. But
Uh-huh.
what are what are sort of the limits of how companies have done product-led growth? I guess maybe a bit of a leading question, but it seems like there's a
Yeah.
certain extent where it's not just a product that can lead.
Yeah. Well, I think like with anything, I wouldn't call it a ceiling. I would call it a plateau. Like there are things that work for a while and then they plateau and you're doing fine, but you feel like you need to do something else. I think adding sales is definitely one of those things. A few years back, I did a major research project where I talked to a ton of product-led native founders who were very successful, as well as founders who were less so successful, and their companies didn't necessarily succeed. And the majority of the very successful PLG founders that I spoke to said that they wish they had hired sales earlier. So I thought that was
Hmm.
really interesting, especially considering all the work I do on the product leading. I think other things that people run into is that we have this fetishization of product led growth where we think everything is incredibly data driven. I have
Yeah.
been lucky enough to pull back the hood on many product led companies, and I will tell you that that is not accurate. And I imagine you saw this at DBT. I imagine you saw this with a lot of your customers there. Getting the data right, at least the architecture and the thinking about how we're going to use it on a day-to-day basis, getting that right in the early days is also really important. Even if you're not like, swimming in a data lake and you're making a million decisions, just like sort of having a doctrine around it and how your company is going to treat it is really important too, or else you sort of lose that muscle memory and it can become really chaotic later on.
Yeah, I find that for companies that one claim that they're data driven, but not really, there might even be a trap where they become kind of data dependent, where it's like, oh, we need more data before we make this decision.
Exactly.
And
It's like you're a
becomes
B2B business. Yeah.
Yeah, like you're not going to get any sort of statistical significance on this. Like, let's make a call. I'm sure we have some sort of hypothesis on this.
Yeah, I'm tired of seeing people hire like PhD data scientists when their total addressable market has like 5,000 companies.
Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to kind of double down on that sales aspect a little bit. It seems like one thing that I've noticed, and I don't know if this is something that you've seen in some of your companies that you work with, but the notion of a PQL was a bit more consumer based. Like I think it worked for Dropbox early days, but from my experience at People AI, we moved to a point where we were saying, wait, PQLs aren't going to cut it. We need to move to like product qualified accounts. Like, do we have a product qualified decision maker or a champion in the product that could actually make a purchasing decision or like have a call with sales versus the end user who's never going to spend 30 minutes on a sales call? Is that something you're starting to see, or is that kind of...
I haven't really taken a step back about it and thought about that persona, but that makes absolute sense to me in terms of a sniff test. Like that's really, really valuable. And however, for some products, especially developer facing ones, like that person may never need to log in. Especially, and that tends to be where I spend a lot of my time. However, I do think that you can flip the PQL thing on its head and say there are certain actions that accounts, quote unquote, accounts take that individual users who are going to use this for personal reasons or less business facing reasons are going to do. So like there are certain integrations that could be that flag, like SSO, if you make that freely available for everyone, which please God do. Or, like they're adding a lot of different people, or they're working with a certain type of technology that's typically only used in enterprise software or something like that. I think can be an indicator that this is in fact an account that has the propensity to buy rather than an end user who's never really going to buy. So it's almost like trying to identify an account by the end user's activities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just when we thought, we sort of figured out PLG, there's all of a sudden this new layer of things to figure out.
That's the thing is like, we haven't figured it out. There's like not a framework or best practices yet. And that's what's so exciting to me.
Yes. I wanted to take us back to, you've kind of alluded to a couple of times, but there's a point where some of the things previously don't work anymore. And you had mentioned user acquisition as one of those things. And you're saying that, founders are running, that's been one of the biggest issues for founders. So tell us about that. Like what are the issues they're running into? What are tactics you're seeing working in user acquisition?
Oh, well, I'm not going to give up my secrets, David. No, I'm kidding. I feel like everyone wants like one single thing to work for them. And that's just not true. Like you have to lean into your strengths. So like to go back to B2C growth hacker lore, Craigslist really worked great for Airbnb. That really helped them sort of get that started. Like gorillas on the ground really helped for Uber. I remember when someone handed me that black card and said, take this black card, it's free. And that really worked for them. Is that going to work for every company? Like if someone handed me an Allbirds card on the street, would it work as well? No, because it's like less sexy and there are different things that work as well. And I think you have to experiment to figure out what works. And that's why it's helpful to have things like an activation metric and a PQL in place so when experiments are working. I will say, what's not working. Everyone's heard so much about how people are ad blind now. Google ads are less effective, especially for product-led companies. They tend to be solving a pain point that we're not even searching for. Like, would you have ever caught me searching for a product that alleviates the pain of using Concur? Probably not. I'm not so interested in my expense reports that I'm actually actively searching for a replacement product. However, enough people were, and Expensify's marketing was so good that they were able to do that. They spent a lot of time on their brand. And I think that's anathema to a lot of B2C or B2B founders, is being able to spend that kind of time on their brand. But once you have that strong brand, you can go and experiment with places like TikTok or billboards or wild B2C things like that because you know that it works.
Yeah. It almost seems like there's a resurgence of like brand marketing with, I mean, there's so many B2B software companies that they're kind of the same product, just with a different color or something. And I won't like name names, but it does seem like there's a resurgence of positioning brand marketing to stand out from the noise now, rather than those growth hacks.
Well, and I will say, like, I think one of the ugly things that is true in product-led growth is that you find these founders who are obsessed with the product and building for the user. And they just think that if you build a great product, people will find it and they will come to it. And that's kind of true for early adopters. And like, if you put it on Product Hunt, a lot of people will download and things like that. But to get the later half of that bell curve, you really do have to invest in brand and being really critical about how you message your product, because not everyone's going to understand why your product's valuable to them unless you really nail it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I feel like PLG alienates traditional marketers when in reality, it brings them back into the circle.
Yeah. It's fascinating how it's just full circle now. One of the things in a benchmark report that stood out to me, because I'm biased and I have an SEO and content background, but organic is a really important piece. It sounds like for PLG companies. Tell us about that. Why is organic so important?
Well, if you're a product-led company, again, it's really difficult to actually determine that someone's looking for you. If you think about, let me think about like Notion. I'm never going to be like searching for the things that Notion does. Because Notion does so many things for so many people, or Airtable. I'm not looking for like an online tabular software that's going to become a database and allow me to visualize data interestingly. But I might be searching for something that's somewhat adjacent to that problem, or someone who sits next to me might be doing so. So if you think about, like discovering Notion organically is because someone shared it with me and I saw that it was really cool and used really cool fonts and it seemed to have like a lot of different uses. That's when that becomes organic, and they have like a really strong word of mouth. Zapier is one of my favorite examples. I probably use it way too much, but they have a really strong play in which, like, if I'm looking to connect two things together, they enable me to do so. And they basically own the SEO if you're looking for like Google Sheets plus MailChimp or something like that. And then like Algolia is another example that I used in the product, where if I'm looking to develop search for an e-commerce website, or if I'm looking to develop search for an LMS tool, all of that's there. If I'm like searching for those types of terms, they own that SEO, because they have so many different use cases and they've covered all of them on the internet.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think you might have called it product-driven SEO, where using HubSpot as a contrast again, very 101, targeting new marketers, learning about their career and how to get better as a marketer. Whereas what you're talking about now this is for people actually looking for the solution. Like, you're trying to do this thing. Here's our product, by the way, that solves exactly that problem.
Yeah. I mean, safety culture is like sort of a new example I've started using, but they actually have like every app in the App Store for like every sort of checklist that any construction worker might want to use. Like, if you want to figure out how to make sure that a light vehicle is safe, they have inspection checklists that you can download in the App Store or find online. And ultimately, these all go back to safety culture as a product. But they just add a ton of value for people searching for them, so that they in turn have that nice brand umbrella.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, you've been part of this product-led growth journey for a while, and you've gotten to see kind of evolve and see more companies adopt it. I think like a large percentage of the Cloud 100, you said, implement or like have some sort of product-led growth. Yeah. So maybe if you could indulge in some pondering, where do you see the next couple of years for PLG going? Like, there's product-led sales now coming up and products around that motion. So love to just hear your kind of brain dump on that.
So maybe this is like wishful thinking. but I'm really bullish on it. I think we've only scratched the surface in terms of like integrated finance and figuring out ways that companies can provide free products that we never actually have to pay subscriptions for. So if you think about
Hmm.
like Stripe, you're never actually paying Stripe. They're just taking a percentage of every transaction that occurs through their platform. Same goes for Toast, which is not a PLG product, but could be if restaurants have their own sort of like iPads, et cetera. And they have like a very minimal subscription cost that's associated with Toast. However, they make the vast majority of their income off of that integrated finance, off of those payments. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that for a lot of product-led products on the market. As well as, and just thinking about what does this future look like where products are completely free or the highest tier of them is completely free as long as you're allowing those transactions to flow through, especially in the API first space. And especially in verticalized software. So my background at Dispatch was again working with contractors. And prior to my leaving, I was working really closely with payment processors to get that set up. And Service Titan, who does this now, the vast majority of their income is not on subscription revenue. It is in fact on payments. And I think about, the
Oh,
types of building we could do to capture payments rather than to capture subscription revenue, to me almost feels like a better world for software products.
that is fascinating. I did not expect
Yeah.
you to go in that direction. So it's
Yeah.
almost
Where did
like
you expect me to go?
I had no expectations, but not
Yeah.
like integrated finance.
Yeah.
So
Let's very
it
pie in
sounds
the
like
sky. Yeah.
it almost sounds like a shift in business model then.
Well, it's just a shift in the direction we're moving where we give more away for free.
Mhm.
And maybe that's very, I don't know, positive point of view on things, but I think that we are moving in that direction where more software is more free. And what if all software was pretty free based on the fact that you're managing, parts of your wallet and it's all occurring on microtransactional levels.
Yeah, it's interesting
Yeah.
because you're making me reflect on some experiences where I'm paying for a piece of software and then a year or something later, I'm just on a pricing page and I realize, wait, the free version has so much more in it now. Why am I still paying for this? I
Uh-huh.
still pay because there's still like one or two features I want, but I have noticed that some companies are indeed making their free tier a lot more robust because maybe that's how they're competing.
Yeah. Well, and companies are so worried about you renewing on an annual basis that they have entire squads dedicated to it. But I almost feel like the payoff isn't as good because they're not driving you to become more engaged with the product. They're driving you for different reasons because they want you to renew. But if your
Yeah.
engagement with the product and how much they make are tied together very closely and your success is tied to their success, I see that as a better world.
Yeah. It's a different
Yeah.
incentive for sure.
Yeah.
Got it.
I think there will always be some element of subscription revenue because it makes it more predictable for a CFO and for the markets. But I do think that integrated finance could be a really interesting angle to build better products for less money.
Yeah. Do
Yeah,
you miss being an operator and like being in house and obsessing on one company?
I really do. Um, I stumbled into VC. I really like the space, and it's really great to have this bird's eye view into a lot of companies. But I think someday I will go back to operating, and I would like to found my own venture as well. Not like VC fund, but like my own startup.
That's exciting. Any
Yeah.
ideas or potential directions you'd want to go?
Well, so I was really shocked when like the product led sales tools started coming out, like Focus, Calexa, and Game,
Yeah.
because honestly, that solved an itch for me that I thought I would really have as an operator. I also, I'm also really into the data space. I really love like reverse ETL tools because they were all very serious problems that I encountered while operating at Dispatch. But those seem to be taken. So I need to find other problems to solve for. I think the best startups are created by founders who felt like a very severe pain and who want to
Mm.
solve for that pain, like Thomas at Calexa. And I think some of the worst startups are solved by people who see a really large, well-funded market and decide to jump into it. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
We might have had the same reaction. When I remember the first time I saw a demo of Pocus, I was like,
yeah,
oh my God, where was this like 4 years ago? That would have
right,
been
yeah,
amazing.
yeah, exactly. So, something along those lines.
Yeah.
just
Well, it's
solving
still
for
early
something I'm dealing
days.
with. Exactly. It is still such early days. And there are always going to be new needs because, again, we're building the PLG rocket ship as we're flying through space. So,
Yeah. Yeah. We're
yeah.
already in space and we're figuring out how to navigate.
Yeah. We're just trying to keep the air on.
Yeah. Well, one thing I learned
Yeah.
about you in my research is you love architecture, design, you renovate properties for fun. How you have time
Yeah.
for that, I don't know. Maybe that's the question. You also have two kids. How do you have any free
Yes.
time? How do you
Um,
manage all of that?
I don't. I think it's all sort of like it's all sort of a trade-offs game. I am lucky in that I love my job and I love software. And when I'm not working, I'm thinking about software. So I almost look at my job as like as an outlet. I'm not like afraid to take my kids places and do things with them either. So like if there's something that I want to do, I make sure I take my kids to it. I'm not just like saving that time. And
What's an example of that? That might be a bit
like
out there.
taking my kids like running and like a jogging stroller, those types of things,
Yeah.
or like taking my kids to the classic millennial take your kids to a brewery, those types of things. They have great things for kids at breweries. It's really wild. And I also am doing work while my kids are around. Like I want to see my kids see me
Yeah.
working, and not make them feel like the world only revolves around them. I mean, they get plenty of like direct mommy time. But having them see me painting or things like that while they're hanging out with me is important to me as well. Because my parents were always working, and I think it really instilled in me a deep love of work. And those are my hobbies, are my free time.
I love that
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah, yeah,
And that I think that point on having your kids see you working and not having a negative concept of work is something that's been kind of new to me, and I'm learning to change my thinking. I spoke to someone named Yvonne Howe. I think she was at Bain, and
okay,
she was like C-level. Her husband was a professor or is a professor at Harvard, two kids. And I'm like, I also asked the same question. How do you balance that? And she said, well, I want my kids to uh, understand like work's going to be an important part of our lives and it will be for them. And it's not a bad thing. Like it's not a bad thing
right,
that mom has to leave to go to work. And I
yeah,
thought that was so fascinating. And it sounds like you're doing something very similar where, it's a natural part of life. And in fact, you enjoy it. So,
yeah.
it should be a positive thing.
I will also say, I mean, COVID is terrible and like the shutdowns are terrible. But prior to COVID, I was seeing my daughter for an hour a day. And the ability to work from home has given me a flexibility that I never ever thought that I would have when I was planning to start a family. And it's been terrible for parents. And I'm, on this podcast sick because my kids are always sick. But in another way, it's great because I've been able to see my daughter grow up and she's been able to see me doing my work as well.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Despite a lot of the bad things with COVID, I think some good came out of it. Lots of
Yeah.
self-reflection and more family time.
Yeah. And just honestly, more networking. Like, do you think that we would have like been on this podcast together, like randomly connected on LinkedIn, had the shutdowns not happen? I'm just like meeting so many great,
Absolutely
wonderful new
not.
people. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. It's been fun
Yeah.
because it's back, a year or two ago, it would be like, hey, we can't meet up in person, but let's do a Zoom call. So no
Right.
travel time or anything. So it's a
Exactly.
lot more
Yeah.
convenient. It's great.
Yeah.
So maybe as we wrap up, got a few questions for you. What's one opinion you have about business you think people would disagree with?
Ooh, that one's tough. One of my more spicy takes. I mean, I think one of my spicier takes, which you can just totally cut out of this, is like MBAs don't run the world. Like sometimes experience is experience for a reason. And while I use a lot of case studies in my work, a lot of the value that I feel like I add for the portfolio comes from me being hands on keyboards, from doing it, from sitting in on demos and trying products. And I don't necessarily think that you can learn business at school not doing business. Does that make sense? Or you could
I
totally wholeheartedly
Well,
disagree.
I'm biased because I'm fully on the
I
same side
know,
as
sir.
the
Okay,
argument as
okay,
you.
okay.
I have friends who are doing great work, and they're like, maybe I should go to business school. And my question is always like, people go to business school to do what you're currently doing, right? Like you're learning so much more than you would if you went to business school. And
Yeah.
some folks, I think maybe there's a cultural thing or some deeply embedded belief that, they need
Yeah.
that degree. But I'm like, you're
Yeah.
doing great stuff already and you can do even more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, like, I was actually planning on going to business school when I started at Dispatch, and then I was like, I should stick around here because it's pretty great.
Yeah.
But and I mean, it can help you pole vault over a lot of things. But for me, the work was worth it, and it paid off. So it's one girl's point of view, and you don't have to take it as gospel. But for me, it's really worked out.
Yeah, I haven't been as loud about that spicy take, so I'm glad you're saying it. Because now I know, like, I'm not the only one who thinks
I'm
this.
gonna get totally flamed on it. I'm also related to a lot of MBAs, so
I think it needs to be said though. I will back you up if needed.
Yeah, I will also add that some of the worst managers I've ever had have been MBAs. So
I will not comment on that, but I'll just leave that there for listeners to take in. What's
sorry for
an
all of
impactful?
your review section.
Oh, it's all good. I'm excited. I want these spicy takes.
Good.
What's an impactful piece of advice that you've been given?
So I wasn't given this, and I think that's my problem. I went to Wellesley College, which turns out like a ton of like finance, like boss women and people who are in consulting and people who do really well in nonprofits. And I was made to believe that my career would be a linear path to success, or else I was a failure. And I think, you're doing really good work on this, David, and Andrew Kaplan's having a podcast specifically about this, but success is nonlinear, and sometimes you have plateaus, just like a PLG company. And sometimes you just take an opportunity because it's interesting, not because the title's better or because, it's at a hot company that you're really like, that's got like a ton of funding and that's doing super well. Like, for example, I took the OpenView role. It was the same title that I had. It wasn't like particularly better on paper in any way, but I took it because I wanted to become more polished, because I was like an operator who was just always hustling, who was always like working really hard on one thing and always grinding. And I wanted to have that bird's eye view, and I wanted to have those C-level conversations with a regular basis so that I could be this really polished executive type person and move on to sort of like this pie in the sky dream that I had in the long term.
Yeah, I feel like that's been said, and it needs to be said more and more. Maybe because social media keeps showing only the successes and not those plateaus.
Hustle culture.
If you're okay with sharing, what's a plateau that you had? Maybe it sounds like right before you joined OpenView, you were at that period or a turning point.
Well, when I joined OpenView, I was 8 months pregnant, so I guess you could call that a plateau just because I was moving really slowly. But I had been trying to make VP for a really long time at Dispatch. And then it took me a few years at OpenView as well. It took me 2 years at OpenView. And I just kept feeling like I was bumping up against this thing. And then when I got it, I was just kind of stunned. But to me, it's sort of like that sort of title was always what I had wanted, but I had felt like I had been pushing for it so long that when I got it, I was just kind of stunned and shocked. And that to me felt like a big unlocking of my career as well. To sort of carry that weight. And it's opened a lot of doors for me when I'm doing my random LinkedIn outreach to randomly connect with folks at PLG companies that I can learn from.
Oh yeah. When you say stunned and shocked, was that in a good way? Or were you like, oh, I guess it finally happened?
I think it was the latter. I mean, I was like, I guess it finally happened. I was kind of just like over pushing for it. Actually, when I was promoted to VP, I was 5 months pregnant with my second child. And, OpenView loves a pregnant woman. Like, they promoted me, they hired me pregnant, they promoted me pregnant. And I was just not expecting it. And I felt like I pushed for it for so long that it actually became less of a priority. And I was like more engaged in work and less engaged in like title culture. So I guess there was like not a true storyline there, and I apologize, but it came as a surprise to me that something that I pushed for so long finally happened. And I think that goes back to the idea that career trajectories are nonlinear, and you can't just like have your eye on one thing and say, this is going to get me there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny how the world works, where you stop focusing on the thing you want as much and you get it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I know we're coming up on time, but last question here is, what's the best place for people to find you on the internet?
I'm all about LinkedIn. You can slide into my Twitter DMs, or, if you're Gen Zer, I'm happy to talk on TikTok too. or you can just email me directly in my Outlook inbox, which is very cool. Sam@ov.vc.
Awesome. We'll make sure to add those to the show notes. Thanks a lot, Sam. It was great chatting.
Perfect. Thanks, David.